Terrific. Welcome to the Newsmakers interview series with Marvin Olasky. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce our interviewee. Mr. Karl Zinsmeister is an American journalist and public policy researcher. From 2006 to 2009, he served in the White House as President George W. Bush's chief domestic policy advisor and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. He is currently a vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Please welcome Karl Zinsmeister.
So Karl, in Washington, people always go by their last highest title. Okay, thus we have what's Secretary Clinton, right? Secretary of State, or we have, if someone was an ambassador 40 years ago, it's still Ambassador so-and-so. So should I call you Chief Domestic Policy Advisor Zinsmeister, or?
Nah.
No, I'd rather call you Rowing Champion Zinsmeister, because this is what I've just found out, that Karl never rowed until he became a freshman at Yale University. Never, ever, right? And within a year, right, you were the national rowing champion. Is that?
Well, that's basically the short story, yeah.
So go a little bit more into that.
Well, Marv and I kind of have one shared common thread in our life, which we weren't terribly happy at this fancy Ivy League school that we both ended up in. And I'm very appreciative of the opportunities it gave me, and don't want to be smarty pants about it, but just culturally it was a very unfamiliar and unfriendly environment for me. So I just sort of threw myself into sports. And I was originally recruited to play football at Yale and did that in the fall and was looking for a change and something different and got recruited into rowing. And at that time, it was one of those sports where if you didn't do it when you were growing up, it was too late. But I had a very charismatic coach who had decided that he could teach wide-bodied people how to row, and I have the physics, I have the size to make it possible, and you have to have good hearts and lungs, and apparently I have a good heart and lungs because it's a very aerobic sport. And so I got into it, and it was just a delight. It's one of the things I loved about it, Marvin, was that what I've loved about my entire career was the discovery process. I love discovering new things and sort of figuring out something that's completely mysterious to me and unwrapping it and mastering it if at all possible, and then moving on. And particularly that first year, I mean, it's a lovely sport. You're on the water. You usually race early in the mornings when the sun is just coming up. It's outdoors. There's no motors. It's very fast. It's a little bit like flying. I had a coach who once described getting 8 men in a boat to row in a coordinated way was like trying to get 8 men to throw a single javelin. The metaphor I often use to try to help people understand it was, imagine somebody had invented a human-powered helicopter. And if you go absolutely crazy, all 8 of you, you'll get it off the ground, and it's terribly fragile, and it's always ready to crash, but it's flying. And that's what kind of rowing feels like. So it was a delight. It was a great escape for me from kind of a social and cultural world that was not terribly happy for me. So.
But, I mean, Patrick Henry College is somewhat of an upstart and takes great pride in knocking off Ivy League colleges at times, debating and so forth. But here in such a short period of time, you could become national champion. I mean, whereas the general thinking at the time was that it had to be something you did for years and years and years, right?
Well,
anyway.
There's a lot of luck involved. I just happen to have a lot of colleagues that kind of came into the pipeline at the same time, and it was fun, and there were so many delightful twists. I mean, I really identified with the whole Patrick Henry story, this kind of, swimming against the stream thing a little bit, and the kind of sneaking up on people who don't understand where you're coming from, and basically using meritocracy to win. And that's kind of what we did. We were not, we didn't go to St. Paul's or Choate or Andover, all the schools that most people learn to row in. I was just a public school kid from a rural part of New York State, and a lot of my colleagues were in that same boat. But we had this very charismatic instructor, and that's all it takes in this country. Is you get people who have some germ of talent and then a lot of enthusiasm, and then you get a good mentor, and you have a level playing field, and really remarkable things can happen. That's just, I've seen that so many times. It's not a fairy tale to me. It's real life.
Okay. And then a lot of Patrick Henry College students want to, particularly those interested in politics, a dream job coming out of college is to go work in, let's say, a senator's office and go from there. Now, you had that experience pretty early working with one of the most influential and still well-remembered senators, Daniel Pat Moynihan from New York. But then you did something highly unusual at that point in Washington, D.C. Tell us a little bit about your building experience.
Well, again, I seem to have a gift for becoming alienated, but I got this very interesting job in the Senate, but and the senator was a fascinating guy. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. He was interested in a lot of the same things you and I are. He was very interested in poverty and in race and in welfare and in immigration and ethnicity, really quintessentially American topics. The problem was, I was there in an election year. He was running for re-election in New York State, and he couldn't even talk about any of those things. He couldn't talk about them honestly. He had to politic. He had the electioneer in a very liberal state. And so it was, in many ways, a disappointing experience particularly because of the gap between what I knew he was capable of, the kinds of fresh and interesting and unorthodox thinking that I knew he was capable of, and what we had to do to win an election. So again, I usually look to bury my frustrations in some other project. And in this case, I was living in Washington, D.C. this was 1981. And those of you who know Washington now, I probably can't imagine this, but Washington was a very bereft city at that point. Had a lot of very poor districts, a lot of beaten down real estate, and it's just astonishing for me today to drive through the city and see the wealth sloshing around in Washington, D.C. That wasn't always the case. And when I realized that pretty close to the Capitol where I worked, within walking distance of where I worked in the Senate, there were beautiful old 19th century houses that had just fallen into rack and ruin in a very romantic way and were just begging for somebody to come rescue them and revive them. That appealed to me. I liked physical labor. My grandfather was a farmer. My dad was an engineer. I grew up with tools. I took the engine out of my mom's car as my senior project and got most of the parts back on, not all of them, but a few leftover parts is all I had to deal with. So that's the kind of thing I've always enjoyed doing. And so I decided I'd buy one of these old houses. And as I say, there's a lot of romance in an old house. If you have any imagination at all, you realize people may have been married in this house. People may have died in this house. The first house I ever bought was actually a candy store for a long time. And I used to often think, that low front window in the front of my house, there would be children coming up here after school and asking for goodness knows what and being told goodness knows what. So it was highly enjoyable. My later career as a journalist, I always loved the playing with crayons part of producing a magazine. It wasn't just the ideas and the articles and the writing, which I also loved, but I loved photography and the colors that you use in fonts and that sort of thing. And when you're building a house from scratch alone, which is what I did. I didn't use any other laborers or any architects or anybody else. I did it all myself. There's a lot of room for that.
Including the wiring and...
Yep, I taught myself. You can teach yourself anything, Marvin. I got out books on how to wire houses and how to do plumbing, and I just grew to love all that stuff. I could do anything now. I could pretty much build this room if I had to. Give me enough time, and it's highly enjoyable. It's very creative work, and I love, I love electrical work. I hate drywall. I hate painting. The fussy sort of fine motor skills are not me. But there's more than just kind of joy in this. There's a lot of joy in this, but there's more than that. I worry that we've become a country where an awful lot of day-to-day life has been consigned to experts. I don't think it's really healthy that none of us have a clue how our car works anymore, and we're completely dependent upon a class of other men who can take care of our cars, or other men have to come in and fix the house that our wife and children live in with us, or other men have to come in when there's a problem in the neighborhood and solve that problem. The traditional notion of citizenship in this country was that you really are self-reliant and you take care of your own business and you have vast capacities to do things. My grandfather could fix anything, do anything, repair anything, and he did. And I don't want to become crazy about that. I understand we live in a new world, and I certainly, lots of things I can't do, but I do aspire to have as many competencies as possible so that when I pull into a car repair place and the guy says, "Oh, your double overhead Hemi is gone and you've got to have a new wheel basket," and I know what he's talking about, a little bit, and I can detect the difference between, reality and not reality. So that was part of it, and I did this. Actually, I've done, I think, 10 houses this way. For a while, it was an economic imperative. I aspired to make it as a freelance writer. That's a very good way to go broke. And I didn't want to take grants, which is somewhat some of my colleague friends did. I thought that would probably prevent me from actually selling my work on the free market, which is how you really get a good signal that what you're doing is worthwhile. If somebody pays a grant, you can easily get off in the weeds and write about things nobody cares about. So I wanted to basically rely on selling my work as a freelancer. As I say, that's difficult. At that point, I had a wife and children, so I decided the compromise is I will have a dual life. I'll have a split personality, and I will work as a carpenter for about half the day. In fact, in the beginning, it was about 3/4 of the day. I would work as a carpenter or a plasterer or an electrician, and then in the evenings, I would write. And I literally did that for years. And as I got better, and as editors began to recognize me and I could get my pieces placed, it then went from 3/4 carpentry and 1/4 writing to half and half, and then it was 3/4, 1/4 the other way. And about the time my back gave out is when I was able to retire and become a full-time writer. But as I say, I never lost the love of that. And even later, when I didn't have to do these houses for economic reasons, I continued to do them. And I've renovated every house we've ever lived in. I've never owned a house less than 100 years old, and I've done, I think, 9 or 10 of them at this point.
So it doesn't sound as if you were always resume building and thinking, okay, I need to take this step to move to this step, to this step, and this step.
Oh,
you had a very circuitous.
I don't give a hoot about that stuff. I really, I follow my loves. Life is such a joy. I mean, it's such a magical world we live in. There's so many things you can see and experience and taste and follow and wander through. I just, like I say, you have to be realistic. I always tell people, don't expect to have it all. If you want to be a freelance writer, it's a delightful thing, but learn to live cheaply. I was telling Marvin, I lived in a travel trailer for 3 years, a 12-foot-long travel trailer for 3 years with nothing but a garden hose as my water supply. That's what it took for me to be able to afford that first renovation experience. And again, it was kind of an adventure. I had a great time. But you have to be realistic. You can't have everything. That's where you have to begin to make compromises. So my advice to young people who want to do difficult or interesting or creative things is learn to live on a nickel. And if you can do that, that's the ultimate power. Because if you reverse the order, if you figure out how much money you have to have, and then you figure out what career goes with that, you've tremendously limited your options. So I never really cared much about professional, those kind of notches in the belt. I felt like they'd take care of themselves. If you really did something you felt passionate about and you loved and you tried to be really, really good at it, everything else follows.
Yeah, good advice. Another unusual thing you did, this is later on during the Iraq War. You were already well established as a journalist, a writer, an editor, but then you went, not just once, but several times, embedded, and actually really embedded in terms of living and traveling and sleeping next to the soldiers, not just going and having cameras on you for a little bit and then heading to a hotel or something like that. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Oh, it was one of those, it was wonderful and horrible, if you know what I mean. Obviously the war was often depressing. That's a very depressing part of the world, and we can talk about that in some detail, but I hope it doesn't sound horrible for me to say this was also a thrilling experience for me because I was doing exactly what you described, Marvin. I would not have covered the first Gulf War, where, if you'll remember, basically it was a bunch of reporters in a theater with the general showing videos of what had happened, and then, as you say, they go home to their high-rise hotels that night and have a steak dinner. Just completely artificial disconnection from reality. But when I first heard that the U.S. government was considering letting reporters onto the battlefield without restrictions, without handlers, without guides, I was shocked and thrilled. That's my style of reporting. Long before that, I'd always enjoyed going out and seeing things and just kind of being in the middle of everyday prosaic events and reporting on them. We had a tradition at the magazine I used to run where every year we'd have a Going to America issue, we called it, where we'd pick a city that wasn't particularly exciting or flashy, like Dallas, for instance. We did one in the Middle West once. And
you're insulting Dallas, but it's not flashy.
Well, I mean, people say it's. I actually concluded it was a fascinating city, but it doesn't have the romance that San Francisco or New York, Chicago. So we went to Dallas and we just immersed ourselves. And I spent a lot of time riding around in the backseat of police cars, for instance. And we went to the shopping malls and hung out. I went to a lot of churches in Dallas, sat through a lot of services. That's the kind of reporting I like to do, to see what real everyday people are doing. And yes, at some point you also probably have to talk to the mayor and the governor and the head of the Chamber of Commerce. I understand that the kind of the elite perspective matters too, But the really fascinating thing in this country is what everyday people do. That's the huge difference between our country and others. I mean, in France or Japan or China or any of the European countries, there's a Mandarin in it. There's an elite class, an intelligentsia that make most of the decisions and that control most of the authority. Our country is not like that. Our country is radically decentralized, and everyday people really do make the most important decisions. And that's terribly frustrating to the professoriate and to the banker class and to all the elite classes that really think they should be running things. But
and a lot of journalists too. I mean,
yeah.
In a world we talk about our great need and desire to have pavement pounders rather than thumbsuckers, but lots and lots of thumbsuckers around.
And there's a role for some of that, but it's way out of balance. Yeah. And I always loved the pavement pounding part. It's just really fascinating. So when I heard that they were allowing this in Iraq, I thought, I'm going. And bless her heart, I have a wife who kind of tolerated this. I think my sisters were a little distraught that someone with children and an old dude like me would put himself in a place like that. But I just thought it was a thrilling opportunity to see how young men and women under tremendous difficult circumstances, under real pressure, would handle that pressure, and would they acquit themselves well as free citizens of our country. And boy, most of them did. And the other thing that I have to say is the embedding experience was cats and dogs. It was all over the place. I know a bunch of reporters who, you get assigned to an aircraft carrier, and for the first 24 hours, it's thrilling to see all those jets taking off. After that, it's Groundhog Day, same thing over and over. I was embedded with the 82nd Airborne, and I was put in with a bunch of helicopter pilots, which was a great place to start because they're very smart people and they're very articulate and well-trained. They were able to talk to me, but after about the second day of combat, I realized they don't park the helicopters on the front lines. They put them back in a safe zone, and if I was going to actually see anything, I was going to have to get away from the helicopters, so I started to move. Now, strictly speaking, I don't think you were supposed to do that. I think you were supposed to stay with the unit they put you with, but they never said otherwise. There were no rules. This is the wonderful thing about it that I loved. There was the expectation that you had to be a grown-up. You did not have weapons. You did not broadcast information that was classified, but other than that, there weren't a lot of stipulations. So I figured if I would present myself to whatever commanding officer I would, of any unit I would find, and tell them who I was and what I was, and I would always say the same thing to them. I'd say, I don't expect you to babysit me. I'm here to take care of myself. If I get in trouble, it's on me, but I want to go with your guys wherever they go. And I went my nose in, right in everything. And most of the commanders were very happy to honor that. And that was, you have to sort of step back and think about that. This is a war. This is a war zone where huge marshaling of resources and expensive things and human lives are involved. And these guys had nothing to hide. They were willing to let me peer over their shoulder. I sat in on top secret, rock drills and all kinds of things. I saw all sorts of intelligence information, and they were open with me. And it was to me, a tremendous tribute to our country. And it wasn't just me, by the way. I mean, when I went in, there were a group of French journalists who went in with us. There was a large contingent from Al Jazeera, which even among journalists, that was controversial as to whether they should be considered fair observers or partisans.
Do the Al Jazeera people have access to the secret planning meetings?
Well, probably not at some level. I mean, you had to earn your way. You had to earn the confidence of the people you were with. But I found if I was just completely straight with them and I told them what I was doing and why, and didn't ask for special treatment, most of these soldiers and their officers in charge were very willing to have me tag along. So I got my nose into just remarkable things I've always wondered about how the military operates. And it was, in that way, thrilling, even though while I say it was, I went, like everyone else, I went for like 25 days, I think, without washing myself. And I spent a lot of time sleepless, and you get weird after a while. The discipline was difficult. I mean, it's a bright country. There was no place where I could read my laptop. I'd have to put hoods over me so I could even see my screen. I was very religious about writing up every day's events before I went to sleep at night, because I knew that if you let that pass, you'll lose all the color and the feeling. So it was a difficult place to work, but it was just a marvelous journalistic experiment. Alas, I'm afraid a lot of journalists didn't make the most of it. But if you were enterprising and you could figure out, you can't just get a cab and go from one unit to the other. I had to figure this out. But I realized after a while that I could kind of bribe my way onto these trucks that would supply the different units, and I would kind of keep my ear open for intelligence, figure out where something interesting might happen, get on one of these trucks and move around. And so I was able to see an enormous amount of the country.
So you said there were a lot of remarkable experiences. Tell us about one of them. I'd say the most remarkable, but just whatever comes to mind now.
Oh, it's hard to say. At one point, I just lucked into, totally luck. I was with a cavalry unit, which, as the name implies, are very mobile. These are about 4 trucks, 4 Humvees with 3 soldiers in each, about 12 people total. And I was off with this cavalry unit in the early days of the war, all by themselves. And they were quite mobile and kind of racing around, but indeterminate job. And then they got a call that said, we want you to be the security for the commanding general of the entire 82nd Airborne, who's going to set up a little camp right here on the edge of a city which was about to be assaulted. So this little group of 12 men that I was with, none of whom had a rank higher than, I don't think there was a captain with us. So maybe a lieutenant was the highest ranking officer. In other words, these are 22-year-old kids. This is not a high-ranking unit by any means, which is the reason, again, I found it so thrilling, because it was real soldiering taking place, and you see the level of responsibility that they have. So, but this little unit suddenly was in charge of providing security for the commanding general. And when the commanding general put up his tent, which was, a third of the size of this room, that was the command post for an entire U.S. Army division for about 3 days. And the general came in, and with his small staff and this cavalry unit that I was with set up a perimeter to defend the place. And it was a very small unit on the edge of a very hostile zone that could easily have been overrun. And it was prickly, and the guys were up all night and watching for threats and shooting at threats when necessary. But I got to, meanwhile, sit there. The commanding general didn't know there was an embedded reporter with this unit at all, and probably not thrilled when he learned there was. But again, I kind of worked with him and earned his confidence, and he let me sit through everything. And it was really fascinating to be in the tent when you sort of see what he has to deal with. I remember at one point we got a report from, well, they don't even like to say this, but it was basically it was CIA who were on the ground in these cities in disguise as spotters, basically. And these CIA agents called the commanding general and said, there's a such and such an individual known to be part of the command network who just went to this tea house, and here are the grid locations, and we'd like you to take this location out. So this huge, fire drill opens up, and the first thing they do is figure out, is there any civilian housing or schools or mosques near this location? What could the possible collateral damage be? And it turned out there were plenty of them. So the goal originally was to put a 500-pound bomb on this building, and the bad guys are gone. But then they realized there's all these other potentially innocent people nearby, so you can't do that. So then it became, can we put a Hellfire missile in there, which is a very pinprick precise munition, but not nearly as effective at doing the job. So then there was a huge calculus of how do you do this, and then they send in the helicopters, and there's the spotters on the ground that are telling what's going on. Really fascinating to see how these life and death decisions get made by people improvising as they go.
Now, with that experience, how does that influence the way you react to, read through, think through reports about what's going on now with ISIS?
Well, the first thing is just so depressing to me. I mean, Iraq is, as I say, not my favorite place. It was always an ugly place. It was an ugly place when George Bush left office. However, it was a stable, functioning democracy. It was a country that had basic control of its territory and its borders, and that had a process in place for solving dilemmas. And at this point, of course, half the country is run by truly barbarians. I mean, there's just no other word. Hellions, really, people who have no respect for any boundaries of humanity. And it's so unnecessary. I mean, if 10,000, perhaps 5,000 troops had been left in that country as a kind of a backbone, that all could have been avoided. And instead, you have these really rootless, really dangerous young men, of which there have always been in history. I mean, I'm reading Winston Churchill's 5-volume history of Britain right now. He starts literally from the Stone Age and goes up to his modern day in Britain. And the terror that the Vikings used to inspire along the British coast when they appeared was exactly what we have today for ISIS. These were people that had no scruples. They would rape, they would pillage, they would steal, they would burn down churches. There's nothing that they would stop at. So this type has always existed in civilization, always will. There will be kamikazes and Nazis and jihadists, and the question is, will civilized people stand up to them? And specifically, do civilized people still have the hardness of soul that it takes to beat down very determined men like that? And that's where it gets hard, Marvin. I mean, you and I are Christians. We aspire to be peaceful and peaceable, and we aspire to turn the other cheek and to avoid violence whenever possible. But there are times when righteous violence is necessary. Our Lord did it. He went into the temple and he turned the tables over, and he literally used his fists to cleanse that temple. And there are times, I think, when as in modern life, where we have to retain that very hard ability to combat and confront evil in a physical and sometimes military way. And so that's something I hope we won't forget, because as you can see, it doesn't take long for the bad guys to get roots if you don't.
Okay, then you joined the Bush administration in 2007 as Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. What exactly does that mean? And did the experience make you feel more or less optimistic about American government?
Good question. Well, first of all, the Domestic Policy Advisor, the President has three main top advisors: the Domestic Policy Advisor, the National Security Advisor, and the Economic Policy Advisor. And the other two are fairly tightly defined and about as you'd expect. The National Security Advisor is basically in charge of the Defense and State Department establishments and the international agencies, and the Economic Advisor runs herd over the Treasury and the economic agencies, and basically everything else is what I was in charge of. It's about 10 different cabinet departments: Health and Human Services, and Department of Transportation, and Veterans Affairs, and Housing and Urban Development, and Agriculture. There are a whole range of departments that I had partial or full responsibility for. And basically, to boil it down, I was the connective tissue between the President and the secretaries of each of those agencies. So I kind of needed to communicate back and forth expectations and needs and problems and issues and desires. And very often, my role would become one of a broker, really, is what it amounted to. And this is something I felt very heavily. When I got into office, you realize no matter how wise or sage you are, you're going to be so disruptive. The tread of the federal government is so big and so heavy today. No matter what you do, you're going to upset all kinds of apple carts, and innocent people are going to get caught as collateral damage. So, I became very prudent, kind of precautionary, and I just of gentleness, I think, is a virtue in a government as big and intrusive as ours. And very often, a tough situation, a tough decision would become one of really two virtues or two good things that are in conflict. And my job was to let the main proponents of those competing points of view have their day in court, if you will. So we would convene a group. Ultimately, there's a whole bunch of preliminary steps, but the final step would be to convene a group in the Roosevelt Room or in the Oval Office, and the President would be there, and the Vice President, and about 10 of us top advisors. And I would, if it was one of my meetings, I would be in charge of bringing usually the Cabinet Secretary of the agency who had something that needed fixing, and then the Cabinet Secretary or two of an agency whose ox would be gored if that was done. And I would prep them in advance to condense and distill their arguments into their very best forms and help them to basically put on a little trial in front of the President so each point of view can get its best possible airing. And obviously there were cases where I had a favorite or a point of view, and I very often tried to keep that out of it. I tried to make sure that the best arguments got aired in front of the man who had to make that heavy decision. Because it rarely was an easy decision by the time it reached the President. The easy ones got solved at a much lower level by staff. The ones that reached the President were almost always sticky. And so I took that broker role very seriously. And lots of it, there are lots of that, Marvin, that I was very admiring of. I mean, there's the word that really comes to mind when you think about life in the White House is duty. A lot of it's just duty. It's very difficult, very unglamorous, very hard, but there are some very good men and women who do their duty, who do their best, who take pot shots and put their own personal lives sometimes in turmoil in order to try to approximate these good decisions. And you know, I'm not one of those who says, gosh, our government is gridlocked and it's such a mess. I mean, people are so silly. I mean, I was just reading some Madison the other day. I wish I'd brought the quote with me. Madison has this wonderful quote. He basically says, you know what, we set up government to be very hard in this country. We wanted it to be difficult to do something via government because we wanted life as a citizen to be easy. And we made this conscious choice to make it very hard to rechannel or redirect or coerce a citizen in any way. So it's a great place to just grow up and raise your family and live a life. It's a very difficult nation in which to be a director or an executive of the government. And you know, that goes back to our British roots, back to this Churchill book. He has a fascinating chapter where he describes how in the 12th century, the 1200s roughly, in Britain, they chose to get away from the Roman tradition. The Roman tradition was make life as easy as possible for the government official. If that government official needs information, he can use torture to get it out of the citizen if necessary. If he needs money, he can extract it any way he wants. Make life easy for the person running the government. And that makes for very efficient government that makes the trains run on time, and there's an admirable aspect to that. It can be miserable, however, to be a serf or a peon or a citizen. And the Brits, when they instituted common law, said, actually, we're going to make it a little harder for a justice of the peace or a local baron to do his duty because we want life to be a little more peaceful and humane for the average citizen. So common law basically said, if you want to accuse me of something, you've got to say it in open court, and you've got to swear an oath before you do it. And there will be no secret testimony, and you can't, you know, all those rules and strictures and limits on legal proceedings or on government that we kind of take as for granted are really not in place for most of the world. Most of the world is set up to be easily governed, and our country is not. So that never frustrated me.
But let me ask more the second part of the question. When you saw Yale up close, you basically ended up being repulsed by it. When you saw the inner workings of the White House up close?
I'd say the opposite. I'd say that my White House experience was closest to my military experience, in that when I got into the bowels of it, I became more admiring. I mean, as a journalist, I think was much more jaundiced and much more cynical about government. And then when you get into it and you see what it involves and the difficulties, I think I became much more appreciative of the burdens that all presidents carry, and much more appreciative of this kind of the stumblings through that a lot of people in government do. I think that's an impulse most people, many people share. I mean, Michael Gerson, who was President Bush's speechwriter, I remember has a lovely passage about this where he talks about kind of the moment he realized how hard and really brutally difficult this work is, and how it made him a little bit less of a wise guy about people who had done it before or apparently failed. So, as I say, I was very impressed with my particular White House. I wouldn't want to be too grandiose because every White House is different, you know. But the White House I lived in and worked in was a place of high character and people that really tried their best to do the right thing, and that came from the top. I mean, the president was a very good man. You can think what you want of him, but he was a very, very good human being, very decent man. He set very good rules. Little things. He insisted we always wear a coat and tie when we're in the White House. He said, this isn't, you know, our office. This is the people's house, and you will respect it in your appearance as well as your decorum and your actions. And he always told me, Carl, don't give me the political ins and outs. I don't want to hear how much it costs. I don't want to hear who's going to dislike it. You tell me the very best policy. My job is to figure out all those other collateral issues, but I want to know, first of all, what's the best idea? What's the most efficient, effective, true solution? So those were the kind of the rules that we worked under, and it wasn't always fun. I mean, my alarm clock went off at 4:15 in the morning, and I got home about 8:30 at night. So, and I had small children, so there were lots of aspects of it I did not like. But I never felt sold out or ambiguous about the value of the work.
Well, what's your favorite specific accomplishment from that period?
Well, there were, some of my failures are the things I'm most proud of. Believe it or not, I really feel like we sort of set the table for some very good things. I like to tilt at windmills, and we did some very interesting experiments. For instance, in transportation, the third world air traffic control system we have drives me insane. Every time I travel, I'm bogged down and delayed, and there's really no reason for that. The only reason it happens is because we have an air traffic control system that was set up in the 30s, literally, and hasn't changed since. Our cars literally have better navigation devices than our airplanes do. Our airplanes, it's all radios. I'm at, 984, where are you? People using voice commands, this is not the way navigation should happen in a modern era. It should be done by computers, using satellite location, and it should all be automated. And it's not for some very silly reasons, partly unions and partly pork and things that are all curable. So I attacked some of those problems, did not succeed, but I think set some precedents that will succeed in the long run. To answer your question straightforwardly, the place I'm maybe most proud was the work we did in immigration. This was really remarkable. Most of Washington, Washington's a huge blob, and it moves as a blob does, very slowly with a lot of prodding and lots of people involved. But once in a while, something extraordinary happens. And I don't even quite know the origins, but for whatever reason, this would have been, 2007, I guess, 4 of us from the White House side, myself and Joel Kaplan, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff, and 2 cabinet secretaries, Michael Chertoff, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, and Carlos Gutierrez, who was the Secretary of Commerce. The 4 of us started a informal dialogue with a group of senators. And it was John Kyle, one of the most conservative senators, and Ted Kennedy, who was not one of the most conservative senators, and Lindsey Graham and Ken Salazar. I would say those 4 were the 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans were kind of the kernel. And then there were some comers and goers who, particularly as we began to develop some momentum, who wanted to join the bandwagon. So Obama showed up for a while, and McCain showed up and spouted for a while. But basically, it was a very small group, and we started visiting them and spending literally 2 or 3 hours without staff in the room. No staff. This is very, very unusual. It was just the senators and these cabinet secretaries and a couple of us from the White House. And we would just kind of hash things out. Very difficult issues at the heart of the immigration dilemma. How do we handle the border? What are you going to do about guest workers? Do we need more high education immigrants and fewer illiterate immigrants? How do we make that happen? And it kind of caught fire and became extremely exciting. First of all, some of those guys, Chertoff and Kaplan are just smart as whips. These are 2 of the most brilliant human beings you'll ever see or work with. The senators showed up with an extraordinary willingness to work together on this topic. For whatever reason, I don't quite know, I can't quite explain it. And as I say, no staff in the room, and all this done in secret. No one knew what was happening. There's a wonderful quotation in Politico magazine that after about 3 months of this, and we had almost a bill written privately in this fashion, Politico figured out what was going on and said, wait a minute, this is not the way things work. Normally you work through the committee system and the Senate, and everything has to be vetted, and all the interest groups get a chance to testify and weigh in, and you have this huge cumbersome process, which is our system, and there's nothing wrong with it. But this bill had not been written in that way at all. And people were staggered and amazed that it had taken place this way. And I'm not sure we really could have done it any other way. And my job, by the way, was to just kind of keep shoveling coal into the boiler. The way it would work is at the end of each session, we'd say, what are we going to talk about next Wednesday? Let's talk about guest workers during the agricultural season. Oh my Lord, then I and 2 lawyers who were working with me on this basically would have to go back to our office and scramble like crazy to go to school on that topic and come prepared 2 days later with a set of ideas and facts and statistics and background that would animate the discussion between these senators and members of the administration. And more often than not, we would end the day saying, we kind of have a rough consensus on this. There was actually a lovely moment. I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham. At one point, very close to the end, he said, I have to tell you all that this is one of the most remarkable things that's ever happened in my life. I've been in politics all my life, and I've never experienced this kind of, people really not trying to ambush each other or embarrass each other or set each other up for a fall. But people of very different points of view, truly trying to find the national interest and collaborate and come up with a golden mean that will work for everybody. And I'll never forget, he said something like, I don't remember the name, he said, this is exactly what Mrs. McGillicuddy, or whatever his third grade teacher was, this is what Mrs. McGillicuddy taught me in third grade, the way civics is supposed to operate, that you kind of sit down and you reason with people you disagree with and you come to a solution. But it never works this way. This is the only time it's ever happened to me. And everyone else in the room sort of nodded, and I think there were a few tears in people's eyes. It was a really remarkable experience.
Well, let me ask, you say came to a solution, but 7, 8 years later,
Yep.
any progress?
Well, as you know, that bill came to the vote and was very nearly passed and did not. And I must say, I don't think it was a terrible decision that it didn't pass. I think we were kind of bearing the burden of history there. There have been, as you know, several kind of grand solutions to the immigration problem that emerged in the past. We all remember them. And they were kind of fake. They were phony. And they were pretend measures to secure the borders, for instance. And then when the amnesties took place, the difficult bullet-biting, measures that were necessary to actually prevent illegals from entering were not executed. And so people became cynical. The public became very cynical about this. And our version really was built on some true sacrificial kind of measures that everyone gave, and it would have been, I think, a really marvelous balance of hard and soft, of carrot and stick, of law enforcement and openness. But there was this burden of cynicism about having been sold a bill of goods in the past, and in the end, the public didn't buy it, and I can't really blame them. And my eventual conclusion was, you know what, we probably got to give it another decade of really doing the right thing on the border and actually stopping illegal entry and deporting people who commit crimes and earning our trust back with the public to say we're not idiots. We do know how to draw a line in the sand. We do know how to do tough love, emphasis on the tough. And once you earn that credibility back, then Americans are very open to immigration. They know that this is a source of strength for our country. What they're not open to is being duped and being suckers and saying that anybody can come. They really want to retain national sovereignty and control over this process to make sure it's a law-abiding process as opposed to a free-for-all.
So in World several weeks ago, we had a very pro-immigration cover story. And of course, we're getting letters right now from our readers, our members, saying, well, look at, you were just basically allowing terrorists to come in and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's certainly going to make any immigration resolution much more difficult.
It's not easy. It's terribly easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater, though. Here, I mean, we are one of the only countries in the world that the hardest working, wisest, most decent human beings want to move to. That is an enormous advantage if we can take advantage of it. What we've been stupid about as a nation is not being selective, not being careful. I think we certainly don't need terrorists. We certainly don't need drug dealers. We really don't need people who don't speak any language well, even their own home language well, illiterates. And that is not a population we should be importing in large numbers. However, people who have business skills or intellectual skills or professional abilities, people who have the technical specialties that we are short on in many industries today, we're insane not to want more of them and to bring them to this country and to let them thrive and prosper and contribute as generations of Americans have in the past. So I think it's, again, I don't blame the public's reaction because they really have been played for fools, but I think the right politician who is able to really sincerely begin to differentiate, not only between criminals and non-criminals, but even finer sorts of differentiation. I'll give you an example. One of the things I'm very proud of that we negotiated into this bill that I was doing the research for was I have long felt that we really, we ought to have more of like a point system. You set up a system where if you can speak English, you get a certain number of points. If you have a higher rather than a lower education degree, you get more points. If you
kind of like admission to Patrick Henry College.
Exactly, a very commonsensical, rational system. This was not brain surgery, but it is not the way our immigration system runs today. Let me assure you, there is no meritocracy in place right now. It's basically luck. If your Uncle Louie happens to be in the country, he can sponsor you and get you in. It's about that crude. And it doesn't matter what your capacities or your ability to contribute to the country are. So I managed to convince the group we needed to have this more meritocratic system. And while, yes, we certainly need to have a big quota for just refugees and miserable people and family reunification and bringing in orphans who need loving parents, those are terribly valuable uses of our immigration opportunities. But how about half of the immigration opportunities being reserved for people who can just contribute to the national interest, who can make us a stronger, wiser, better country? And as I said, I was very proud to add that in. We developed a very detailed, very, I think, workable system that would give people credit for these capacities and allow a meritocratic system to exist next to the humanitarian system.
Well, there's a lot more we could talk about this, but we do need to get to your current mission, namely philanthropy. So tell us first briefly, what's the Philanthropy Roundtable?
Philanthropy Roundtable is a kind of a brokering group that tries to help philanthropists, donors, find projects and partners at the nonprofit level that they can work with to try to change the world in positive ways. And we have about 600 or 650 members, and a lot of them are living donors, big people who have been very, very successful in business and now want to use some of their earnings to help others be successful. And some of them are foundations. And really what's common, Marvin, with my past is this is a group that's trying to solve social problems. That's really what most philanthropists do, and that's certainly what we as an organization try to aid and abet, is to identify serious social problems, whether it's crummy schools in inner cities, or it's problems getting health care to old people in rural areas, or it's, Alaska natives don't have dentists up in their rural villages and their teeth are falling out, and that can make your life pretty miserable. It can be anything along that spectrum of kinds of problems, and we try to find a way to solve those problems without getting government involved for several reasons. First of all, because government only has so much reach and breadth. And second, because philanthropists tend to solve problems in different ways, usually in much more inventive ways, in creative ways, and efficient ways. And so it's, to some extent, an extension of my prior work in, as I say, solving social problems. Philanthropy is a kind of a legislature. All these little projects are basically votes. They're people saying this matters, and this matters, and this needs fixing, and that deserves attention, and funds should be directed in this area. And government sometimes gets jealous about that. I mean, those are kind of competing functions. Sometimes government and philanthropy have different notions of how a particular problem should be solved, and that can be fascinating to try to navigate.
And one thing you can do in philanthropy is you can actually do stuff. In other words, I mean, this sounds like a great project that you were involved in when you were in the White House with bringing together the various senators, the various department heads. But at the end of the day, still, I mean, it was a great concept, but it didn't go anywhere in terms of actual production, whereas the philanthropy, you can do stuff.
That's one of the things that's so satisfying. It doesn't just change the rules, it actually changes people's lives.
You have an almanac of American philanthropy that's going to be coming out, and you tell lots of stories about people who have done that. And maybe it would be good briefly to just tell a few of those. I mean, I was just reading it yesterday, and Milton Hershey. What did he do besides putting out some pretty good candy bars?
Yeah, well, I mean, the candy bar thing was not trivial, first of all. You got to realize, when he started off, chocolate was a very rare treat for rich people, basically, and he democratized chocolate. He made this is something you could buy for a nickel. Anybody could afford it, and in the process, he made a lot of money. He had just a miserable life, Marvin. His father was a drinker, and there was a very unhappy home life, and he was scarred by this, as anyone would be, and he and his wife were unable to have children, but based on his own experiences with an unhappy home, he was very anxious to try to save other children from having to go through those same trials. So as he became an increasingly wealthy man, he started using his proceeds to set up kind of one house at a time, a little house with a den mother and a den father. He would get a married couple to move into the home and be basically surrogate parents for children who'd either lost their parents or whose parents were derelict. And it was literally just surrounding his own home. And there was originally one house, and then there were two, and then there were 10, and then there were 20. And he built up this ring. He created a very impressive orphanage, basically, that not only gave these children love and attention and affection, but also gave them basic education and taught them industrial arts that would allow them to make a living. And the Milton Hershey School became just a tremendous institution. It's really transformed a lot of lives. It's had some very impressive alumni. And at one point, Milton announced, "I'm giving my company to the school." He said it much more poetically. He said something like, "My wife and I are going to adopt the orphan boys of America as our family," and he gave the entire company. I don't mean a lot or a stock gift. He gave the entire company to the school. The school still owns most of the stock in the Hershey Company. It's worth about $11 billion right now. And as a result, about 2,000 kids go through this school every year and really get their lives transformed. So there's some wonderful examples like that in a fairly traditional field. Helping orphans is a biblical mandate, but there are fields that are much less predicted or understood as well. Libraries would be a classic one. People don't forget there's so many things that we take for granted. You think, well, public libraries are that's part of civilization, right? No, public libraries are an American invention and basically invented by philanthropists. It was Ben Franklin in particular, who were early on said, this is part of democracy. If you want to have a country run by everyday people instead of the mandarin, which I was describing earlier, you have to help those everyday people understand life by giving them books and access to information and knowledge. So there's been a long and really noble tradition of people who have given libraries and books and then opened them. And that was often the crucial thing. It wasn't just the resource, it was the rules. The philanthropists have been tremendously important setting rules that make these resources valuable. For instance, there's a fellow named Peter Cooper who set up a college that included a very large library where tradesmen could come train themselves in New York City. And one of his early stipulations was, first of all, you're going to let everybody in. We're not going to have women excluded. We're not going to have manual laborers excluded, which were the norms in those days. We're going to let anyone in. But then little things. He said, this library is going to be open till 10 p.m. at night because working people who are out making a living want to educate themselves, improve themselves, and move on. And if you have gentlemen's hours, that's not possible. So those were the sorts of things that very often the rules and the protocols that philanthropists inject into their work are as important as their money.
Yeah, Andrew Carnegie setting up libraries. How many thousands?
Yeah,
right?
Close to 5,000.
Yeah, around the country. Boston Public Library, New York Public Library. These were all coming out of philanthropy.
And there's so many untold stories. I mean, for instance, during the period of time when government, which of course is today always assumed to be the savior of the undertrodden, well, very often government actually has been on the side of the majority and has not been terribly friendly to the downtrodden. And an example of that was during the Jim Crow era, where it was very difficult for a poor black family and even a lot of poor whites in the South to get any education at all. And recognizing this, a whole series of philanthropists went to the South, built schools with their own money, hired teachers. In some cases, had to set up the colleges where the teachers would be trained so they would be able to be good instructors, and got a whole system of education going that government was scandalously neglecting. There was a fellow named Julius Rosenwald, whose name has disappeared from history, but he's the absolute hero of American history. He was the guy who got Sears Roebuck really running as the Amazon.com of its day, turned it into just a huge powerhouse, made a lot of money in the process, and used most of that money to set up several thousand schools, I think 4,500 schools or so in the South, all across these rural areas where there was no opportunity otherwise. But at the time Julius Rosenwald died, more than a third of all of the black children in the South and more than a quarter of all the black children in the whole country were being educated at one of his schools. So if he had decided not to do that, you would have had a mass ignorance problem. You would have had a whole level of deprivation that we didn't have. It would have taken probably another generation or two or three for us to reach a situation of closer to decent equality in this country. And that was all done basically with one man's determination.
Yeah, even in military matters, which in a way we think of as the quintessential governmental activity, provide for the common defense, but you tell the story of Alfred Loomis.
Really a fascinating story. And it actually goes beyond that, Marvin. I didn't realize until I got researching this, but there's a long tradition in this country of people just kind of spontaneously gathering together to provide for the common defense. The very famous early frigate, the Essex, the USS Essex, any of you who are kind of sailing ship fans will know that name. I didn't realize until I got into the research, but the Essex was built by the citizens in this little town in Massachusetts who just got together and decided that the French rebels and the Barbary pirates are driving us crazy, making it impossible for us to live, disrespecting our nation and our flag. We got to do something about it. And lots of people gave $5, and the wealthy citizens in town gave $5,000. And they literally took up a subscription, raised about $70,000, built this ship with a lot of donated wood. That was the other way you could contribute if you were a farmer, bringing your oak tree down. They built this ship, they hired a captain, and they handed it over to the U.S. Navy. He said, go get them. So there's this tradition, and I didn't realize how far it went. This gentleman that Marvin mentioned, Alfred Loomis, it's just fascinating. He was a natural scientific mind, just a brilliant man who felt he had to make a living, so he went into Wall Street and made a lot of money as a Wall Street financier. But then as soon as he could, retired from that and threw himself into his science and was not just a dilettante. He really was a first-rate scientific mind. He set up a tremendous workshop, better than any college scientific workshop in its day, across the street from his home, pretty much, in Tuxedo Park, New York, north of New York City. And he was doing some very interesting research of all sorts in the 30s. And then in 1938, he went to visit Germany. And he was struck by two things. One is how much affection there was for Hitler in the country. And the second was how good the German scientists were. And he came home very disturbed, convinced that war was brewing and that science was going to have a lot to do with who won the war, and acted on this. Didn't write a letter to his congressman, but took action himself, used his private fortune, thought hard about how he might be able to contribute, and decided that the very new science of using radio waves to detect moving objects might be useful to the national interest. And he basically did most of the early American work in what we now call radar. He actually developed working prototypes, took control of the US government program, produced thousands of radar sets that went into airplanes and ships, and really, truly turned the course of World War II. And this was done by a private gentleman. By the way, his method was, again, back to what we discussed, it was more his method than his money that mattered. He had this very pioneering method where he was not hiring radar scientists, he was hiring the best scientists he could find, physicists, chemists, whatever they were, smartest minds. He would protect them from bureaucratic interference. He would give them whatever resources they needed, and he said, just you go to work. And it sounds commonsensical, perhaps, but it's not the way government science worked then or now. And this method was so successful in radar that when people began to realize that the atomic bomb is possibly going to be part of this war rather than the next war, they whole hog took Loomis's method and transferred it to the Manhattan Project, as well as most of his scientists. They actually took about 2/3 of the scientists that Loomis had gathered together to do the radar work and transferred them over to the Manhattan Project. So Loomis was, in effect, also the father of the Manhattan Project.
Interesting. We have a few minutes left for questions from any of you, either on some of these philanthropic stories or anything else that Karl has been dealing with here in his varied career. Well, if there aren't any, I want to ask you to define two words that are in the Almanac of American Politics that may be new for lots of folks here. We do have a questioner. No, but quickly here, relinquishers. Tell us, explain that. That's a word that should become part of our political vocabulary.
Yeah, well, it certainly is true. A very smart fellow wrote this story and he coined this term, but the concept is much older. I think there's wise statesmen realize that sometimes the best thing you can do is just get out of the way. And the term was used by an individual in this case to say that if you really want to be a good administrator, sometimes you need to let go of control and power and let organic forces on the scene with firsthand information about what's going on solve their own problems. By the way, that's something I felt intensely in the White House. That was maybe the biggest lesson I took out of the White House, is that sometimes leadership is really not what's needed. What's needed is deference to local forces that will solve the problem if you don't get in the way. So that was something that really rang true with me, and it's a big part of philanthropy too. Because again, there are usually people in most communities. They know what the good schools are. They know what the good doctors are in that neighborhood. From Washington, you have no idea which the good doctors are in that neighborhood. You have no idea which the good schools are. So by relinquishing and equipping those local saints to solve problems, you will often have a much better outcome.
But really hard for people who have spent years trying to attain political power to be willing to relinquish it once they have it. Other word here that's useful, polyarchy.
That's a favorite of mine. It's maybe counterintuitive unless you think of it as the opposite of monarchy, okay? Monarchy is obviously one person or one authority controls nearly all of the power. Polyarchy is the opposite, where power is broadly distributed, widely distributed among many competing power sources. And that is a much healthier way of solving problems, we have learned. I mean, that's the story of the internet today. I mean, when Marvin and I were, computers for us when we were young meant a box about as big as half of this room that had one central processor and a huge amount of wires and was tremendously centralized. And that's the way information flowed too. So there was a kind of a central basis. And the story of the internet today is that you can actually solve problems better with lots and lots of little actors working independently, the kind of the hacker culture, if you will, on a large scale. That's the power of the internet. Not any one central authority, but the fact that so many people can put in their 10 cents and their thought and their bit of expertise, and you get a very powerful result. So polyarchy is basically that concept, that a very broad base of authority. And again, I mean, if government tends to be a monarchy, philanthropy tends to be a polyarchy. There are no dominant philanthropists. It's let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah. Poly-questioning. We have a questioner.
It's really cool to hear about the American way, and it's actually thrilling. Specifically, I was wondering, what are some of your favorite organizations where young professionals are doing what they should to serve the country and just live the romantic American dream?
Well, I don't want to kind of, anoint people unfairly one way or the other, but there are some really, a couple of impressive groups that have changed the world. The Federalist Society is maybe the simplest model for me to cite to you. This is not a very old group, 25 years maybe? There were a group of people that were concerned that the legal profession was kind of acquiring an orthodoxy that didn't really represent the full span of opinion and worldviews in the American public. And rather than complain about it, they set up a little group and they got some donors to give them some grants so they could start holding conferences and publishing journals. And they created an affinity group. And they didn't say they wanted to close down the American Bar Association. They just said, we want to compete with them. We want to kind of get our own little salon going. So this group of initially just a handful of law students and law professors set themselves up as a counterpoint to this very kind of conventional liberal orthodoxy that was dominant at that point in the legal profession. And it just took off. I mean, that's the wonderful thing. If you really believe that your ideas are accurate, you don't have to stack the deck. You just have to get a fair play. And that's all that they really needed, was a little bit of fair play. And this attracted people. It attracted students. Every single law school in the country now has a chapter of the Federalist Society. Lots and lots of young lawyers want to be in the Federalist Society. They're attracted by its understanding of the American founding, its understanding of American principles. And it's a cool thing, and it's really changed the legal profession. A huge number of Supreme Court clerks and prominent attorneys and elected officials have been schooled through the Federalist Society, and it's really changed our jurisprudence in this country. So that would be an example.
Any other questions?
And by the way, there was a very small grant that got that going. I think it was a $25,000 grant that set up the first Federalist Society meeting. I mean, there's this tendency to think that, you need millions of dollars and you need to, it all starts with just a little germ. And it often doesn't take much more than a few people that are intelligent and passionate and with a little bit of resources to get a little fire going. And, that's true in so many areas of philanthropy that, things kind of, and even if your own particular project doesn't become big, as the Federalist Society did become big eventually, even if yours doesn't, you have to have some confidence that the guy in the next town over is doing something similar, and the guy in the next state over is doing something similar. And, if I'm planting seeds and tending my garden here, and Marvin's planting seeds and tending his garden down in Austin, and somebody else is planting seeds and tending their garden in Seattle, pretty soon the whole world is green. And that's the way that philanthropy works. And it just takes a little bit of imagination to understand that it's an aggregation. It's again, go back to the internet metaphor. It's lots and lots of nodes and people doing fascinating things in lots of places. And no, none of them are huge, but collectively they have tremendous power. When people think of philanthropy, they think of the Gates Foundation. And rightly so, the Gates have really done some wonderful things. I'm an admirer, actually. But I don't know if you realize how trivial the Gates Foundation is in the larger picture of things, but Gates is very small. Even in their central passion, the thing that they feel most strongly about and pour the most energy and money into is overseas global health. I think people know that. Well, guess what? The grand total spending of the Gates Foundation in overseas global health, compared to the spending by just average churches and synagogues around America, the churches and the contributions coming out of those churches for overseas works is about 4.5 times bigger than all of the spending every year by the Gates. So there is this, again, you don't see it happening, and so it tends to be invisible. People for some reason, don't have the imaginative leap to understand that all of those little givers are pooling themselves together and really surpassing this single huge giver in their overall footprint and importance. And that's a story you see in lots of parts of America.
Yeah, we're going to have to conclude, but here's another questioner as we continue with our poly questioning.
I'm just curious what you're thinking about the Republican race. I'm not asking who you're supporting, but just
well,
what's the state of it?
It's pretty easy to get grim and cynical about politics, and I'm not really a very political person in the capital P sense. As I say, I've never been a horse racer, and I never really wanted to work in the White House. Those things just kind of happened accidentally. However, I learned a long time ago not to discount American, the sort of the middle American view. And clearly there's a huge appetite today amongst people that you're seeing in the Republican primary, and to some extent in the Democratic primary as well, for the outsider. And where does that come from? What does that mean? Well, to me, it's kind of understandable and explicable. I think people are very disgusted with the mealy-mouthed, very artificial dialogue that you get from a real polished politician today, which neither feels sincere nor is sincere in most cases. And that's, I think, accumulated to the point where it's really put off the voting population to the point where they are reaching for people that, in my personal judgment, are quite inflammatory and extreme and kind of unmeasured and unprudent. People that would scare me in office for the reasons that Marvin and I were discussing earlier, this huge footprint of the federal government and the importance of being gentle and the importance of not swinging your elbows too hard in that office where you can do so much collateral damage. I prefer humble, kind of quieter, more modest styles of governance. And some of the people, as I say, that are attracting the most attention in the Republican race today are not in that mold. However, I don't think it's either foolish or indefensible that the public is hungry for that. I completely understand that hunger. So the golden mean here for me is to find somebody who is willing to really put aside that mealy-mouthed, phony, kind of tell everybody what they want to hear style of professional political decorum without becoming someone who breaks all the china and really forgets all the things that our mothers taught us about being respectful and not rude and prudent.
I think that's about as much as we're going to get.
Yeah, that's as far as you're going to go for endorsements. Yeah.
But let me just close with one question for you all. If you're an artist, where do you think the pot of money is bigger? National Endowment for the Arts or Kickstarter? Since 2012, Kickstarter. And that's a remarkable story in and of itself. Many more remarkable stories, but that's all for now. Please join me in thanking Karl Zinsmeister.
Thank you.
Well, sorry there weren't more folks here, but
no
this would be
problem.
great for the world.
Sure, yeah.